Hello again and welcome to The Luxury Choice, a B2B technical sales and business podcast brought to you by the training team of George James Limited. My name is Steve Vaughan. I'm a senior sales trainer at George James, as well as the host and producer of this podcast. This is another of our mid-month guest interview shows where I chat to a subject matter expert we think you, the listener, will find of interest and value. Today my guest is Mark Davison. Mark is the CEO of Grant Instruments, a leading scientific equipment brand and research technology innovator. Based in Cambridge, Grant manufactures general lab equipment and with a specific focus on cryopreservation and cell biology solutions. Mark is also a podcaster. He's the presenter of the Big Experiment podcast, on which he interviews founders and CEOs to find out how great science gets out of the lab to become big business. Mark, hi. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Steve. Brilliant. Great to be here. And it's refreshing to be a guest for once. I'm sure you're the same. It's always good to be on the other side of the mic every now and again.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about your podcast, and I'm a big fan, by the way. So definitely want to find out more about your podcast, what got you started on that during the chat. But I guess first of all, for the benefit of the listener who perhaps doesn't know yourself, could you say a little bit about yourself, your background, and what got you to Grant Instruments?
Yeah, so a fairly long and varied background, I suppose. So I started off as a biochemist. So I trained at University of Edinburgh in biochemistry.
Right.
Didn't do the PhD route, went straight into industry, joined SmithKline Beecham as it was back then, now GSK, of course, and did 7 years in the lab, doing all the things that scientists would do, just they had a parallel track for non-PhDs. And then one day there were two replicated departments, one in North America, one in the UK, and as happens in big companies, they decided they only needed one of them. So the whole site was closed down.
Right.
So at the time, of course, that's a big issue. You know, anybody who's ever been made redundant, you know, it's a gut punch at the time.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah.
Now, looking back at, decades later, it's actually something where you think actually that was probably a liberating event in a way, with the benefit of hindsight. So then I looked around for jobs. I looked all sorts of different jobs from same again, other drug companies. I did an interview with Mars Corporation to figure out how to make toffee gooey in the center of chocolates.
Wow.
I interviewed with Yakult to see how to make those concentrated yogurt goops that was coming into the UK at the time. All sorts of different stuff just to think, what the heck am I? And eventually I got a job up in Scotland with a part of what is now Charles River in commercial business development, just selling their services, and knew absolutely nothing. Literally raw green bench scientists who could, a bit gabby, but not really much sales experience. And luckily, was able to kind of learn the ropes on the job and went from there. So a gradual progression of commercial jobs really since then through CROs, a bit of consulting. And then latterly, I had a sort of 10, 12-year period in anti-counterfeiting of all things. So after losing another shirt in biotech, I went into a slightly left field area of looking at how do you stop fake medicines getting to the supply chain, which is a fascinating world we can talk more about if you're interested, but it's really a very different world in terms of that parallel medicine supply chain. And then ended up the job before this one, developing the rest of world operations for an American software company that was doing traceability software for drug supply chains, successful in the US and needed to expand. And I was employee number one outside the US. So we set up the UK and European operations, and then latterly actually a Russian operation as well. So I was commuting to Moscow every 6 weeks for a while there.
Gosh.
Which is hard to believe nowadays, but
yeah, sure.
It seemed normal back then. And then, with Grant Instruments, just again, one of those serendipity things. I think that's marked my career really, that I happened to be talking to somebody I knew over a coffee who's a headhunter and, just passing the time of day. And he said, I've got this role at Grant. And I said, what, you mean like the people who make the water baths that I used as an undergraduate, those Grant? Yeah, they're that one. And there we are, interviews later. This was in probably October. And I started at Grant Instruments the week of lockdown.
Oh, wow. What timing that is.
So we'll come on to what my first few months were like, but it wasn't much to do with scientific instruments for a while.
No, I bet. Gosh. So you've been there since early 2020 then, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
what was that like then, joining in lockdown? I mean, that must have been a completely weird experience, really.
Yeah, it was. And, as anybody, we were key workers because we made things that were needed for the antivirus effort in a way. So, lab equipment was needed for the virus testing labs and so on. So we didn't ever actually shut down. We furloughed some people who weren't needed and we spaced everybody out and did all those things. But the first few months was very much around, how do I keep everybody safe? How do we keep each other safe? If you remember back to the early days of the pandemic, I don't know about you, but I was going home and getting changed in the garage and taking a shower before I met the family.
Oh yeah,
Get out of the house. You'd done something dangerous.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff was still very fresh. So there was no test, there was no vaccine. Young people were dying from the disease. So it's really all around, how do we keep people safe? So,
for sure.
Putting up Perspex sheets and getting hand gel and face masks and all of that kind of practical stuff. In between trying to keep morale reasonable and make stuff and ship stuff and all the other things that you need to do as a manufacturer.
Wow. So really in at the deep end, really, in a almost unimaginable way, really, with the extra complexity of the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, but then with a very good team.
Sure.
It wasn't like I joined a bunch of sort of directionless people. Everybody knew their role and everybody was very brave, I think, in hindsight, just even turning up in a group setting when people had families at home, took a bit of gumption. And we didn't have anybody who was a refuser, who said, I'm not going to come in, it's too dangerous. It was like most companies, I think people just get on with what they have to get on with.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm glad we're over those days. That's
completely.
Distant memory now.
It was an interesting time for us. I'd recently joined Georgie James, and I'd been building up my own prospect list, and I had all this classroom training booked, which of course got cancelled. But as you say, sometimes opportunities come along, and we reverted to a remote platform, which ended up being, a big opportunity for us. So, I know Grant. I think I've sold your products in years gone by. I've certainly, aware of the companies. But for people who don't know what it is that Grant make, could you just give us a bit of an overview of the products and the markets?
Yeah. So we are actually just over 70 years old. So we were formed in the 50s, and the original product, the classical product really, was the scientific water baths. So how do you keep something at the same temperature in a precise, controlled way? And that was, it seemed like such a simple product nowadays, but to do that in a very precise way was new back then. And also things like chart recorders. How do you record things in a scientific experiment? All this stuff that we now do digitally was analog. It was pens with, like earthquakes were measured back in the day. So those kind of early products became a more general laboratory instruments business, which we are today. So we sell globally. We make products mostly in Cambridge, but also with a joint venture in Latvia. And we make a whole bunch of things, from things which keep things warm and cold. That's probably our core business, temperature control in the lab. So things like circulating chillers to keep reactions cold, still make water baths. But we also make cryopreservation equipment, for example, so that you can not only freeze but thaw your cell vials in a really controlled way, which turns out to be quite crucial for viability. So that kind of added value product, as well as tube rollers, vortexes, desktop centrifuges, all those kind of benchtop essentials that every lab needs.
Interesting. Yeah. And how do you sell your products? Is it directly through distribution? Is it a mix of those things?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So most of the lower value stuff goes through distribution. In our industry, there's several big names in distribution. There's people like Avantor, Thermo Fisher, people like that who agglomerate lots of different smaller providers into their catalog business. And we do some direct selling, typically for the higher value, added value products. Some of our more sophisticated refrigeration equipment, some of our cryopreservation equipment. You really need to understand the user case before you can really give them the product that they need. And it helps us to learn as well. So we have a relatively small direct sales team, and then distribution channels as well.
Gotcha. So one of the things I wanted to explore with you, Mark, and you've kind of alluded to some of it already in your introduction, really, is the role of the CEO. I think you're a company of about 70 odd people, so that's a medium-sized sort of company. What does a CEO do, and what's a typical kind of day if there is such a thing?
So the second one first, there isn't really. And the first one is probably, it depends who you ask. But in in terms of I think that one of the core roles, there's a few core roles. Clearly, in a small company, then a lot of it is cold face. You have to make sure that the stuff that's supposed to happen is actually happening. But with good managers, you don't need to be really in the details of that. You can just let them do their job. So it's really around what is the vision, communicating what the company's trying to achieve, taking care of the big picture stuff. So, that can be shareholders, joint venture partners, some of our major global accounts. I would get involved in personally with the sales director to make sure that we really give them the service that they need.
Okay.
And then around that kind of, some of it is around evangelizing the brand as well. These days you can do a lot on places like LinkedIn that is kind of soft power. You're not just hammering, buy my stuff, but you're bringing people towards you as a brand and as a person by hopefully adding value in the content that you're putting out there. So there's an element of all of those involved in a CEO of a small company these days, I think.
Got you. So it's a mix of the strategy, the big picture stuff, where do we want to be, what's our vision, but there's also quite a fair amount of operational stuff in there as well, the day-to-day stuff as well.
There isn't a manufacturing business. Clearly, right. We actually make stuff. So, if there's a blockage or, then you do need to get involved in that kind of area. I'm not a manufacturing expert, as any of my staff will tell you, but sometimes it's not about the engineering solution. It's about allowing people to ask the right questions,
sure,
to answer their own questions.
That's
often where it leads, and just coordinating that team dynamic. And often I find, particularly in a small company, your key task is choosing what not to do. Strategy is partly about choosing where you go, but it's mostly about choosing where you don't go, because it's very, very easy to bleed resources in a small company.
Absolutely.
And doing a lot of things badly instead of several things well.
Yeah, great point. And I want to pick up on what you said about being an evangelist for the brand, which is a phrase I love, actually. And you mentioned LinkedIn particularly. Now, we're connected on LinkedIn. I do follow you on LinkedIn, and you're very active on LinkedIn, far more active than many other CEOs I can think of, really. So that's obviously a deliberate thing from your perspective. What got you doing that, and what's the approach you've taken to LinkedIn? Are you kind of self-taught, or have you been on, LinkedIn training? How have you got to where you are now?
Yeah, no, it's all just trial and error, really, in my case. I mean, there are some very good, people who do systematize an approach to LinkedIn. But in my case, it's really around just trying to be interesting, trying to add value, trying to do things that people want to read, look at, listen to, in a way that is not overtly selling, but is still brand connected in some way. And the good thing about LinkedIn is you can be yourself. You don't have to be a corporate robot. In fact, that's what works the worst, is if you try to just say, here's a press release, please read. So I try to come at it from different angles, sometimes, with a frivolous, humorous post, sometimes with a bit more of a deep thing. I don't know about you, but I find that the ones that clang the most antiviral posts are the ones that you think, wow, that was brilliant. That was real insight I gave there. That was a corker of a post. Press send, and then you get tumbleweed.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's very hard to predict what works.
No, you're right. And, I'm self-taught on LinkedIn as well, although we do LinkedIn training for salespeople. But, I think you're right. Experiment to find out what works, what doesn't work. One of my best ever performing posts was an April Fool when I said I was going to quit my job to be a rock singer. I wish. But you never know, do you, really? I think as long as it's appropriate. But what I love about you do, it's consistent, I think, with your personal brand. The personal brand that you built up, I think, over time through your own network, really. And is that why you've started doing a podcast, or is there another reason for that?
The podcast was a number of things. Firstly, I think it's a great genre for talking to people. So that's an obvious statement, isn't it? But for getting under the obvious with people. So you get 40, 45 minutes with somebody to really explore what makes them tick. And the bit that I was interested in was really that interface between the idea or the laboratory experiment or whatever it might be, and the practical application of that in a business. So that's why it's called the big experiment. It's the biggest experiment you're ever going to take is the hypothesis, I can make this commercially successful. Yeah. Talking to people about how they do that. What makes you want to do that? You're in a safe lab environment. You're maybe on the progress towards tenure track. You've got a career there. Why would you dump all that and take your idea and go and try to raise £1 million and then another 5 million to see if you can make a success of it, when the odds say that you may probably not? Wow. So that's for me what the kind of technical reason why I wanted to just explore those pieces. And of course, Cambridge area is a fairly rich hunting ground for that type of stuff. But I've gone a little bit wider than that and sort of hooked in some old friends and people with interesting life stories to just give it a bit of more width as well.
I was going to ask, where do you get your guests from? Is it through your personal network? Yeah,
yeah, a bit of everything. A bit of sort of groveling messages on LinkedIn. Some work, some don't. Also, just bringing in people that I know. One of my guests, George Ajibang from Ghana. Fascinating guy. He's emigrated to the US. He set up a business. He's now a philanthropist, giving money back to Ghana universities there. So he's come full circle. So I just love stories like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's called The Big Experiment. So if you're not listening to The Big Experiment, listener, then you need to pick up on it. It's a really great podcast, and it's fascinating to listen to these clever scientists who decided to become entrepreneurial business people. It's a fascinating podcast.
Very much, Steve, thanks. And the other benefit for me, of course, is it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah.
As you well know, if you go into a podcast not having done a bit of research, then it's very long, 45 minutes.
Well, let's see. Well, I've done my research with yourself because we met, I think it was last year at a Gambika conference. If you don't know what Gambika is, it's a trade association for the scientific equipment industry here in the UK. And I remember you gave a very thought-provoking talk about sustainability and Grant's approach to the environmental obligations a manufacturer and an organisation have. So perhaps you could just say a little bit about that for the benefit of the listener now, Mark, as to why you've done that and where you see the benefits to the business in doing so.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head that for me, the best driver for sustainability is because it makes you money. It generally saves you cost in the long term. It may cost you money in the short term, but it'll generally save you money in the long term. For me, I've always been committed to trying to do the best I can, cycle to work when you can, try and be as vegan as you can, or, low meat at least, and just do, not absolutism, but maybe just try and do a bit.
Moderation. Yeah.
And we, as a business, we have just moved. So we were in an old facility, single glazed, oil fired central heating. The carbon budget of that place was ridiculous. So we decided that the only way we could really make a big dent in those what's called scope 1 and 2 emissions, in other words, the things that you have in your own control, was to move premises. So about 18 months ago, we did that, which cost some money in the short term, but it means that we are now in an electrically heated building, which means you can use wind turbines instead of oil. And it's well insulated, it's modern, it's spacious, it's airy, it's what we need it to be as a business. So as well as the business rationale, there was a sustainability rationale to move as well, which, kind of helped to improve that. And in general, we try to, be as eco as we can, try to source things as sustainably as we can. That gets a bit more difficult with things like computer chips and steel sheet and so on, because there you have to rely on international supply chains. But you can definitely be quite canny about some of the local decisions that you make, about some of the transport decisions that you make, electric car schemes at work, that kind of thing, that really encourage it in your team to be as green as they can. So it comes back to the point I made about absolutism. I think it's not so much about are you as green as you ever possibly could be? It's are you on the journey to being greener than you were yesterday?
Got it, yeah.
And that's as important, I think. If we all did a small amount of it, then everybody gets along.
Got it, yeah. So there's obviously a business payback from the investment that you've done in terms of moving to the new building. Presumably there's a return on that investment in terms of lower energy costs in the medium term. But is there also a benefit in terms of your sales strategy? Do you find that your customers or your distributors are asking for this kind of a policy and approach as well?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. And I think it's gone from being, are we going to sell more, to are we going to defend the sales we've got? I think for our industry, it will eventually get to that point where it's not negotiable. Yeah. So we were assessed by one of the external bodies. It's called EcoVadis. And, we did pretty well, but that was a lot of hard work to get that rating. And therefore we can now show our suppliers that yes, we are sustainable. And this independent third party body says so. Because typically the big suppliers now are getting pushed by their customers, who in our case probably are a multinational pharmaceutical company. And those big pharma companies are being pressured by government payers to say, well, we're not going to buy that unless you prove that it's a green product. So therefore it cascades right down to the people who make the stuff that makes stuff. So it's becoming more and more of a theme, particularly in Europe. Interesting, I had a conversation this morning with somebody from a US company developing a new product line. And I said, how are you going to build in sustainability into that? And it was quite a new concept, I think, in their thinking. Mm-hmm. Whereas I know if I'd done that with a European company, it would have been, it would have been built in, or they'd have been thought about at least earlier on. So I think that's in the process of being globalized.
Right. As I recall, at the meeting we were at, there was a presentation. I think it was a guy from AstraZeneca as a senior purchaser. He was saying basically, if you don't have a sustainability policy, you don't supply to AstraZeneca, period. Yeah. So clearly there's a business benefit there as well. So
there is, and I think that's going to get more so. And, it comes back to the point that it's everybody's planet, isn't it? So it's not that we should see it as a penalty. We should see it as an opportunity to improve how we do things. Can you use less material? Can you move things around less? Instead of going A to B to C, can you go from A to C? Just those transport miles. There's all sorts of things you can do in quite subtle ways in your business that will drive down your total carbon footprint, and everybody wins, including the bank balance, because it costs you less to run the business.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. So what's looking at the business now, looking at where you see your business from a strategy point of view, we talked about the role of strategy for a CEO. Where do you see the biggest challenges for the business right now, looking forward over the next sort of 18 months, couple of years?
Yeah, I think there's a few. At the moment, the life science research industry is in a bit of a flat year, I would say. It's not a crater, but it's certainly a flat year. So therefore, when they sneeze, we get a cold. So that, you just have to ride those out sometimes and just wait and just be sensible with costs and make sure that your business size is appropriate to the turnover that you have. And sometimes that means hard decisions. You occasionally have to let people go or not rehire in a post when you really need somebody, but you just hold on to the funds for a while longer. So that can be awkward to manage, and you need to make sure that, you have a proactive approach to morale and being as transparent as you possibly can, I think, is the key for that. Just making sure that, people know that, sales haven't been great this month, but here's the reason and here's what we're doing about it. And, it's all fine. In terms of strategic, from our perspective, it's not a very integrated industry. There's lots of small players, and I can see consolidation in the coming years. It would make sense, really. Most other industries eventually coalesce a little bit. So from our perspective, we'd like to, be driving that rather than, being a victim of that. And I think for me to get there, what I'd like us to be is moving up the value chain. So a lot of our products at the moment are relatively standardized. So they're benchtop equipment, right, crucial in the lab, but not necessarily particularly differentiated, with the exception of a few areas around refrigeration, as I mentioned, and cryopreservation and those kind of things. So I'd like us to double down on those areas where we do differentiate and move up the price point in the value chain so that we can really defend a proposition that isn't just a metal box that does things quite simply, sure, but it's something that is a little bit more value add.
Got you. One of the conversations I've had with many people like yourself, sales directors as well, and VP of sales, those kind of people over the last year or so, is, and I'll put it in the context of ever increasing competition, Far East competition, some degree of commoditization in the marketplace. One of the biggest challenges that people seem to say to me at the moment is getting people, getting hold of good people and then keeping those good people, through, training and development and those kind of things. Is that something you're focused on as a business?
Yeah, it is. And obviously it would be nice if times were a bit more vibrant and we were bringing people on. At the moment, we're not hiring because there's really not the budget to actively, aggressively hire except for replacement hires. But one of the things that we did a couple of years ago now, actually, is think about, well, how can we make the workplace a better environment for the people that we have? And we've had flexi time for a number of years, and therefore we can see when people choose to come to work. Obviously, there's core hours, but there's a choice. When do people choose to come to work, and when do they choose to do the minimum possible? And to no one's great surprise, Fridays were very much the least preferred option for people to stack their hours into. So a lot of people would front load the week and would do the minimum possible hours on a Friday. So somebody came to me and said, well, why don't we try the 4-day week? Let's call the bluff, as it were. Let's say you work hard Monday to Thursday, we'll give you Friday off. Being sort of old grizzled cynic, I took some convincing, really, because the sort of, anti-startup boss, isn't it? That sort of stuff, giving people time and things. But so what we did was a 3-month trial, and we said, well, we've got the metrics. We know what the business does now. We know what the output per person. We know the sales numbers. We know all that stuff. Let's see what happens if we do a 4-day week over 3 months. And then at the end of it, we'll take a look and, we'll see whether we want to continue. And actually the metrics, all of the output metrics were the same or better. So sales did not dip. Output did not dip. Staff well-being metrics, how do you feel about your job, went up, not unreasonably. And people just really, really liked that weekday. The benefit of having a Friday is that you can go to the doctor, you can go to the library, the gym, you can, go see your mom and dad, whatever it is you need to do. You've got a weekday to do it in, that is quieter and easier than a weekend day. And so therefore, it really did have a step change in the way that we view the work-life balance. People work very hard Monday to Thursday, and then Friday is a day for yourself. Now, the two exceptions to that are, as a business, we are, from a customer-facing perspective, we're open Monday to Friday still, as we all.
Of course, yeah.
So the sales team work a rota where, if you work the Friday, you get the following Monday off, and work from home, with the usual internet phones, you can do that very easily. And the same with customer service. So as far as the customer is concerned, you can get hold of the business. We will interact with you. We can solve whatever you need to be solved. In terms of the factory, it's dark on a Friday. So means we get the benefit of reduced overheads because we're not paying heating, lighting for another day of the week. And it means that everybody's synchronized. We looked at a couple of ways that you can do a 4-day week. One is that you allow people to choose which day they take. And we didn't like that because you end up with a mishmash of things. You never know who's in, who's not. So we decided, right, we'll stick to 1 day and we'll see if that works. And yeah, here we are 2 years down the line, and it's stuck. And I wouldn't do it another way.
Fascinating.
Now, if we expand and we need to double our volume, then clearly you need to do things differently.
Of course, yeah.
But I don't think we will change the ethos that each individual works 4 days. We might work more days of the week physically, but each individual working 4 days seems to fit really well.
It's really interesting because one of the things I've always subscribed to as a manager myself in business is most people want to do a good job. Most people want to work hard, and it's our job as leaders to create the environment to let them do that, really. Yeah. And I think the great analogy, really, or the great example of that was, again, the pandemic, when, a lot of companies were concerned about people working from home and will they effectively, try it on and not do much. And I think most businesses found their productivity actually went up, if anything, rather than going down, because most people, I think, want to do a good day's work, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And obviously, from our perspective, we actually make things. So one thing I can't do is send people home with a box of parts and a...
No, of course not, no.
So that you have to manage that a bit carefully.
Yeah.
Because, that working from home, we do allow working from home. But obviously that means that the people who make things and assemble things can't work from home. So therefore you need to be, make sure there's an understanding that working from home means the W bit counts. You're working from home. You're not walking the dog from home.
No, of course not. No.
So, and there is that always that element of trust that needs to be there. But we find, as you found, that the difference in between work quality from home and the office is not there. And in fact, as in all walks of life, people who are skivers are going to skive, and people who are going to work hard will work hard, more or less independent of the system that you
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. So what's the future going to hold for the business, and then possibly for yourself, Mark? Where do you see things in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time?
Yeah, I think we are now coming out of this mini recession in life science research, and the green shoots are definitely there. I've been talking to people this week from big companies, small companies, and there's definitely a more of an activity in Q3 as we're now in than there was in the first part of the year. So I think that will start to gather momentum, and I think we might see a little mini boom in the next year or two. So for us, it's really about capturing that trend, making sure that we are delivering what customers need us to deliver, making sure that we look both ways. So we need to be vigilant for competition, particularly for lower cost products. India, China, historically you bought from there because price was more important than quality. Whereas now you don't always have to make that choice. There's very good low cost products. So we need to be really careful that we keep up with that. But also on the other side, moving the business into higher value propositions, areas around biotechnology, cell banking, the whole cryopreservation piece that I mentioned, areas where you can do something that other people don't do, or very few people do, that is valuable to the customer, and the customer is going to pay you a good price for. So that whole area of cell-based research, as opposed to what we've been before, which is predominantly chemical, biochemical, wet lab kind of research, I think is an interesting area for us, and we'll see where it takes us. There's very interesting stuff in the kitchen.
And just to come back to something you said right at the start, and it's a slight aside, I guess, really, but you said about in one of the roles you had in your career was involved in kind of, and I'm probably using the wrong phrase here, but sort of fake drugs or drugs that don't work. I'm really interested as a scientist, albeit a lab scientist. I'm really interested to know a bit more about how that worked, really.
Yeah. So just to clarify for the tape here, I wasn't involved in fake drugs. I was
no, absolutely. Please, please put that right.
So that came about again. It's one of those sideways career moves, but a biotech company that I was involved in folded, as they do, and I was looking for a role. And the headhunter said, we've got this thing with a Swiss company that does security systems.
Right.
And the company was making security systems for banknotes predominantly. It's a world leader in security inks and so on for banknotes. Your average £20 note has got dozens of features that you can see and ones that you can't see to make sure that it can't be easily copied. And they needed somebody to do the same for pharmaceuticals. And I thought, well, why? Who's going to fake pharma drugs? It doesn't make sense. But when you dig into it, where there's muck, there's brass, and where there is that kind of money-driven ethos is there. And at the time, it was Viagra was the real catalyst.
Of course, yeah.
So Pfizer was making a lot of money from Viagra when it was still in patent, and criminals realized that they could make pretty much any small blue pill and sell it in a Viagra-looking box, and people wouldn't ask too many questions. So, and that was spreading to other medication as well. So lots of different drugs were being copied or diverted or adulterated, lots of different problems. And the world needs solutions to that. So for 4 years, I traveled the world doing anti-counterfeiting systems and products for governments, for big drug companies, small biotechs. Just generally, it's a really difficult problem to stamp out because it's as lucrative as narcotics and much, much less risky for the criminal.
I never thought of it that way, but yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Because if you get caught with fake medicines, then it's probably a fine. You get caught with a few kilos of cocaine and you're definitely doing some time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in some countries, it's a death sentence. So that disparity between risk and reward really drives the criminal behavior. So you're starting to see that again with some of the weight loss drugs, for example, where it's typically worse in lifestyle drugs. So drugs that are not life and death, although we do get fake cancer drugs. But if it's a lifestyle drug that somebody's paying out of their own pocket and they're paying $1,000 for a syringe or a course of tablets, if the criminal can make a plausible looking copy and charge $500 on the internet, there will be people who will make that saving or buy them, either not knowing the risk or accepting the risk. And that's obviously a backdoor to all sorts of nonsense. These drugs are made with very little regard for GMP, good manufacturing practice. They can be adulterated. They can be, if you're lucky, they're just chalk dust and they do nothing. Or if you're unlucky, they can, there might be floor sweepings in there, rat droppings, who knows? All of these things can be very nasty. So yeah, that was an interesting aside in my career, which is, and then subsequently carried that on independently in consulting as well for a few years, and then latterly more in the software side of the anti-counterfeiting systems rather than the hardware.
Fascinating. You've had a varied career, Mark, and I'm sure there are a lot more things on the horizon in the future for you as well. So thanks so much for joining us on Luxury of Choice today, Mark. Where's the best place for people who want to find out more about you? I think I know the answer to this, but where is the best place for people to find out more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously you can contact me through Grant Instruments, just go to the Grant Instruments website, but I think LinkedIn's probably the easiest way. I'm happy to take connections with anybody who's interested. So you can find me, Mark Davison, on LinkedIn, and connect with me there. And I'm happy to help, provide answers, do whatever I can. I see LinkedIn as a give and take community. It's not something where I'm just broadcasting. It's something where I'm quite happy to have conversations with people. So yeah, look forward to meeting people.
Me too. I wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for LinkedIn, probably. So folks, if you've enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app and tell your friends and colleagues all about us. Also, we would love you to leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. It does help us in lots of mysterious ways. And if you would like to contact the show or ask a question, you can email the team at podcast@georgejames-training.com. That's podcast@georgejames-training.com. I'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with my colleague Jonathan and Prue, where we'll be looking at another aspects of sales. Until then, happy selling, and I'll talk to you soon.